So, over the past week, one of the more interesting transactions occurred within the past decade, and of course, I am talking about the Ben Simmons and James Harden trade. Now, originally, I was going to jump out the window and make a very reaction-based take, and honestly, I felt that was going to be a bit irresponsible. So instead, I decided to step back, really look at this transaction from a wider lens, and even take into perspective other people's accounts of what just occurred over the past year or so, just in case I was overlooking some bit of information. And now, with a clear mind on what exactly occurred, I can genuinely say that both teams are massive winners in this transaction. I know, right? You probably were expecting me to have some crazy hot take, but no. I believe that this is one of the very rare situations where a team can trade a top 10 player in the NBA and still turn out to be massive winners in this transaction. Now, to be fair, that does not mean every entity in this transaction is a winner, because there is certainly one loser in my opinion, but I will touch upon that later on in this video. But on a macro level, when you look at the players that were traded and the teams that received some of these players and assets in return, I genuinely believe that this was the best scenario for everyone in the situation that they found themselves in. And let me explain. First, we have the Philadelphia 76ers, and honestly, I don't think I have to do that much explaining to why a team who received a top 10 player would be a winner in any transaction. But in short, as we all know, Philadelphia is an organization that purposely lost games to position themselves to obtain talent in hopes that one day that talent would be good enough to translate to a championship. The result of all that tanking manifested a duo of Embiid and Simmons, and in the beginning, it was fairly easy to be optimistic about what the young duo could do in the NBA. However, as each postseason transpired, it became very obvious that something had to be changed. And due to some very embarrassing moments in last year's postseason run, it was clear that Simmons was going to be the one that needed to be traded. Now, that process was easier said than done, as Simmons' trade value not only dropped because of another poor postseason run, but also the 6'10" point guard refused to play for Philadelphia after some questionable comments being made towards him from his fellow teammate in Joel Embiid and his head coach in Doc Rivers. And because of this, the Sixers really didn't have that many choices. Either they were going to trade a player that they once viewed was the face of their franchise for fringe all-star players, or patiently wait until the star caliber player that they wanted became available in the open market. Which is honestly the biggest reason why I view Philadelphia as a massive winner in this transaction. In the months leading up to the trade, many people thought that Daryl Morey was a madman. Holding on to Ben Simmons in hopes that a superstar caliber player will become available just seemed idiotic. Especially when you think about it, any trade conversation that consisted of Simmons, Philly more than likely didn't have that much leverage. But with a few teams underperforming and the Sixers still being a relatively good team in the Eastern Conference, the patience from the Sixers front office actually paid off. Now, it is important to note that Harden so far this season hasn't looked like his normal self, and because of this, the talent isn't just so overwhelming that it allows me to overlook some of the potential problems, because there's definitely some potential problems. The hamstring injury that Harden is sustaining is definitely a concern moving forward, especially because normally those type of injuries linger on way more than just a week or two. And for a team that I assume had probably a little bit more leverage than a lot of people want to admit, it is a bit odd that the Sixers had to give up not only Seth Curry, but 2 first-round picks in the process as well. But hey, you can easily argue that is the value of a top 10 player in the NBA. So even though the complaints are there, they're not so daunting that I can't call the Philadelphia 76ers a winner. And actually, I could argue that James Harden is the perfect fit for this Philadelphia 76ers team. Picking up Harden means that the Sixers still retain some of the better attributes of Simmons' game, his passing and playmaking, while providing a level of shot creation and floor spacing that the Sixers have desperately needed throughout Joel Embiid's tenure on the team. And because Philadelphia was able to keep both Maxey and Thibault, they still have a really good rotation of competent guards. Also, I think it's important to note that Joel Embiid is by far the most talented big man that Harden has ever played with in his entire career. So not only will Harden have various different ways to finish in a pick and roll set, which is something that I am very excited to see, but also with the amount of miles that Harden has put on his legs throughout his time in Houston and even over the past year and a half now, I do believe having a player like Joel Embiid, who is playing at an MVP level right now, will benefit Harden's prime, or at least extending it as long as he possibly can. So yes, again, pretty obvious why Philadelphia, why James Harden, and why Joel Embiid all benefit from this transaction. Now over in Brooklyn, it may not be as clear, but try to follow me. Last year when James Harden was traded to the Brooklyn Nets, I was one of the very few people who questioned the necessity of having Harden on a team that already features Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. Now don't get me wrong, I thoroughly understand the premise of adding as much talent as you possibly can on a roster, but at what cost? The Brooklyn Nets not only gave up depth, but also defensive presence, as well as a lot of draft assets in the process. Now one could easily argue that a lot of those assets, especially when they stand alone, are not that valuable, but together they definitely hold a lot of weight. And for a team that already featured Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, adding more offensive firepower in James Harden not only felt redundant, but again, not necessary. And because of that undeniable fact, it's the reason why I did not pick the Brooklyn Nets to win a championship last year. Actually, I didn't even have Brooklyn coming out of the Eastern Conference. Now, to be fair, if everyone was healthy, of course that Bucks series would have went a little bit different, and I'm completely open to that concept. However, that's kind of proving my point once more. When you build a roster that is overly dependent on three players performing at relatively high stages, then you don't leave yourself with any wiggle room. And then you have the COVID mandate and Kyrie Irving refusing to be vaccinated, which then kind of dissolves to where we are right now, where the Brooklyn Nets are making this trade while in the midst of a 11-game losing streak. And even though, yes, it is true that James Harden is the most talented player in this transaction, when you put into context the situation that Brooklyn was in, as well as just looking around the NBA and looking at other valuable options for the Nets, even though they are dropping in talent, they're definitely picking up in value, which is the premise of my argument that I want many people to understand. Now I get it, it's easy to dunk and bash Ben Simmons, and because Ben Simmons is the best player that the Brooklyn Nets received while giving up James Harden, I thoroughly understand why it's so easy for some people to look through this perspective that the Brooklyn Nets lost because they lost a lot of talent. However, what many people need to understand not only about this transaction, but about the NBA at large is that it's not always about talent, but more so about value. Draymond Green is the best example of this. As an individual talent, there are definitely things that he can provide to any team. Passing, rebounding, defense, versatility. But as we all know, Draymond has some very glaring limitations. And because of those limitations, the value that he could provide to any team heavily depends on the situation that he finds himself in. If Draymond was in a situation where he had to be the second scoring option, or he had to be on a team that needed a floor raiser, his value to that roster, quite frankly, would not be felt at all. But because he's on a team that has ample floor spacing, the first and second scoring option are off-ball players, and a defense that heavily relies on versatility, the value of who Draymond Green is exponentially increases to an all-NBA status. So to make the correlation back to the Ben Simmons and Brooklyn Nets trade, yes, it is true. James Harden as a talent, he provides floor spacing, ball handling, defensive manipulation, and shot creation. In short, his talent is offensive leaning. However, on a team that features Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, how valuable is that? Would it not be more valuable to add defense and depth to a team that has been significantly lacking in those two departments for the better part of the last year now? As Seth Curry is an upgraded version of Joe Harris, Andre Drummond provides some size inside for the inevitable matchups against Joel Embiid and Giannis, and then you have Ben Simmons, who allows Brooklyn to retain some of the positive offensive attributes of James Harden's game that best benefits playing alongside Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, such as his passing and playmaking, while also providing the defensive versatility and intangibles that this team has desperately needed, especially if they want to compete for a championship. So yes, it is true. Brooklyn lost talent, but what they received in return is more valuable for what they want to accomplish moving forward. And for the people out there who don't agree with me, let me ask you this question. Would the Golden State Warriors ever trade Draymond Green for James Harden? And the fact that you're still hesitating to answer that question proves my point. So, for Philly and Brooklyn, I think this trade is actually really favorable for both teams. Now, no, that does not mean that I think that this transition with this level of talent will just be smooth and seamless. Of course, there will be some hiccups along the road, and those hiccups are based in some concerns that I have, and quite frankly, those concerns are the reason why I do believe there is one individual who may turn out to be a massive loser in this transaction. But before we get to that point, just just briefly, in terms of Ben Simmons, I think this is the best situation he will ever find himself in. So if this doesn't work, if you believe that people were doubting you and booing you before, I cannot imagine what will happen if you underperform in the playoffs when you're on a team that, again, best benefits your style of play. And furthermore, I don't want to make it seem like Ben Simmons playing this pseudo Draymond Green role will be easy. He definitely has the talent, skill set, and physical traits to pull it off, but does he have the mentality to do so? Because I genuinely believe for you to perform at the level of Draymond Green, you have to have a mental edge that I do believe is fair to question if Ben Simmons has. So when it comes to Ben Simmons, I do believe there is some pressure for him to perform at the level that we're expecting him to, especially since we are accepting who he is as a player and lowering the bar on what he's expected to do offensively. And then on the other hand, we have James Harden, and I'm sorry, I cannot ignore the ongoing trend that happens in his career. He forced Dwight Howard out of Houston, then he forced Chris Paul out of Houston, then when a duo of him and Westbrook didn't work, he forced his way out of Houston. Then he didn't like his situation with the Brooklyn Nets, so then he forced his way out of Brooklyn, and now he's on Philly. Now, for some of the people who are a bit more forgiving of Harden for some of the decisions that he has made up until this point in his career, you could easily legitimize his decision to force his way out of situations that just weren't favorable to him. But here we are now in Philly, and there are no more excuses. If Harden wants to be on a team where he is primarily on ball and he doesn't have to share the scoring load with another ball-dominant perimeter-oriented player, but still wants some offensive load taken off of him from a front court presence, he has that. If we believe the best way to utilize Harden is on a team with ample floor spacing, but not surround him with one-dimensional floor spacers so he's stuck creating offense for everyone like he was back in 2018, well, he has that. And then on the other side of the floor, if Harden at this stage of his career doesn't want to be held responsible for playing defense consistently, he doesn't even have to do that because he not only has both Matisse Thybulle and Danny Green on the perimeter, but also has a help defender in Joel Embiid protecting the paint. So literally, this is the best situation for James Harden that anyone can conjure up. If he doesn't win here, I'm sorry to the people out there who are optimistic about who James Harden is. The excuses stop here. And this is the reason why this trade is so interesting. Because unfortunately, somebody's going to underperform. Someone is going to lose because both of these teams are in the same conference and will inevitably have to match up with one another if they both believe that they can make it to the finals. Which is a reason why I say these next few months can really make or break Kevin Durant's legacy, and let me explain. Going back to the summer of 2016, Kevin Durant made the decision to leave OKC because he was on a roster that overly depended on his skill set to not only create shots but space the floor for other players who lacked the scoring prowess that he deemed necessary to win a championship. Because of that decision, he found himself with the Golden State Warriors, an organization that gave Kevin Durant literally everything that he was looking for. After 2 championships in 3 years, he no longer wanted to participate on that team and decided to make a drastic change in his career and go down this path alongside Kyrie Irving out in Brooklyn. He sat out his first year due to injuries. His second year, he was on and off the court again due to injuries. And then right when he was on the precipice of proving to everyone that he was as great as everyone believed him to be, it yet again fell apart due to injuries. So now here we are, third year into Kevin Durant's career as a Brooklyn Net, and things are starting to fall apart rather quickly. Because as I record this video, the Brooklyn Nets find themselves with the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. And no, this is not an 8th seed that's only a half a game behind the 7th seed. The space between the Brooklyn Nets and the 4th and 5th seed is pretty wide. To make matters worse, there still isn't any clear understanding if there's going to be any changes in the mandate that would regulate Kyrie Irving's play. Kevin Durant is still dealing with injuries and there's still no clear timetable to when he's going to be back on the floor. And even though, yes, I did highlight how great of a trade package that they received with Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, and Andre Drummond, those 3 pieces only work alongside both Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant when they're completely healthy and available throughout an entire postseason run. And with Kyrie missing home games, KD not available to play due to injuries, and the Brooklyn Nets having the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference, which means there's a good possibility in the first round, but certainly in the second round, they're going to have to match up with either the Miami Heat, the Milwaukee Bucks, or the Philadelphia 76ers. And if Kyrie Irving still isn't available to play home games, or they didn't get enough reps and chemistry building with Ben Simmons and Seth Curry, then there's a possibility, ironically, that Kevin Durant finds himself in the exact same situation he was trying to remove himself from back in OKC, on a roster that is overly dependent on his skill set, him clocking in 40 plus minutes a night at an advanced age of 30 plus years old, and doing all that with the possibility of the result of the team still losing in a 7-game series. Now that's tough. And if the Warriors go on to make the finals or even win a championship, while Kevin Durant is getting knocked out in the first or second round, the conversations around Kevin Durant, his career, his legacy will drastically change. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoy my voice and if you love it when I talk about basketball, you can go to my second channel where I upload a little bit more frequently, or you can follow me on Twitch where I do live streams talking about basketball as well, and it's a great way for me to interact with my audience. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.